Coming up, how do we know the threat of tyranny is coming from the left and not from Trump? I'll answer that question by looking at some comments by Solzhenitsyn, by Václav Havel, and by George Orwell. Debbie's going to join me for our Friday roundup. We're going to talk about Israel and President Macron's arms embargo. We're going to talk about whether pro-lifers should feel comfortable in voting for Trump, and also the political lessons of Hurricane Milton and Hurricane Helene. Hey, if you're watching on Rumble or YouTube, listening on Apple, Google, or Spotify, please subscribe to my channel. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
America needs this voice. The times are crazy. In a time of confusion, division, and lies, we need a brave voice of reason, understanding, and truth. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
I want to update you before the weekend on Vindicating Trump. I think you know there is a book. It's out. It's doing really well. Grab your copy or copies, and you can get them right from Amazon or Barnes & Noble or from the movie website, which is vindicatingtrump.com. The movie is still in probably 50 or 60 theaters this coming weekend and the following week. So you can see it in a bunch of theaters. And if you plug in your city or town, it'll tell you if there are theaters near you. But because it's only a smaller number of theaters, you may find, no, I can't get in the theater, but no worries, because starting next week, the movie will be available in DVD. It'll also be available in a few days for streaming. All the details are on the movie website, vindicatingtrump.com. You can order DVDs right now. They're going to be shipped to you starting Monday, so you'll get them really quickly. Now, I thought I would talk today about a theme that is addressed in the book, touched on in the movie, and the question is simply this: is the threat of tyranny coming from Trump, or is it coming from the left? Now, one way to answer that question is to look at what Trump did, or maybe even said, that is supposedly so tyrannical. And here you'd be hard-pressed to find very much at all. Once in a while, Trump will say something generally whimsical, things like, well, I'm not going to be a dictator, but maybe for one day. And if you're the kind of person who goes, oh, there you go, he's being tyrannical again. But for most of us, we realize that that is Trump doing his shtick. That's Trump's one-liner. Trump is being almost a partial comedian. And moreover, you can judge a dictator by his actions. Dictators, when they come to power, generally immediately set up a regime of repression. That's what Hitler did in 1933. Hitler took power in 1933. When did he become a tyrant? 1933. And the Democrats have a greater burden of arguing that somehow Trump came to power in 2016. He was there till 2020. He didn't do anything tyrannical, but guess what? If we let him in the next time, he's definitely going to become really tyrannical. Well, that's implausible. That doesn't make any sense. But we can answer the question in a more profound way if we look at the characteristics of dictatorial and tyrannical regimes. And here we need to turn to some of the kind of wise men of our age, people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Václav Havel, who was the Czech dissident, later became the prime minister of or president of the Czech Republic, and of course the great George Orwell. And I want to read you a few comments by these figures, not comments that are well known. I mean, I obviously covered Solzhenitsyn in the discussion I did of the Gulag Archipelago over several weeks of the podcast. But here I want to talk about Solzhenitsyn, who talks about how in the Soviet regime, law was always infinitely elastic. And what he means by that is that Soviet jurists would in fact have hearings, interrogations, investigations, trials, but they did so in the understanding that the trial is not about whether you determine whether someone is guilty or not. Of course they're guilty. The trial is merely about coming up with some kind of a rationale for why this person is getting a punishment that you want to give him anyway. And here, Solzhenitsyn invokes a guy named Andrei Vyshinsky. And here's what Solzhenitsyn says about him. He says that this guy Vyshinsky was a genius at coming up with, quote, the most flexible dialectics. And Vyshinsky would argue it's never possible for mortal men to establish absolute truth, but relative truth only. What's he saying? He's basically saying, listen, when a crime happens of any kind, we're not on the scene. We're not there. We can't see what actually happened. We have evidence. And the evidence is going to be probable or more probable or very probable. But Vyshinsky goes, because evidence is always like that, let's forget about trying to achieve certainty. Let's basically just go on whether there's more evidence for it than not. What he's doing is he's essentially converting the legal process into something completely subjective. And he's basically saying, if you want to get some guy, you can totally get him. Because after all, there's always some indication that points to the person's guilt, and all you have to do is weigh that more heavily than the indications that he didn't do it. And so this is the so-called Vyshinsky doctrine, which is that it's useless to seek for absolute evidence, call it evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Evidence is always relative. Now, let's turn for a moment to Václav Havel, who says the following about the tyrannical regime in the modern era. And ask yourself if this describes Trump or if this more closely describes what the left and the Democrats have been doing. He's talking about the tyrannical regime, and I now quote, "It touches people at every step, but it does so with ideological gloves on." What this means, of course, is that the tyranny is not for everybody. It's ideologically determined. You are prosecuted for ideological reasons. I continue to read. "This is why life in the system is so thoroughly permeated with hypocrisy and lies. The arbitrary abuse of power is called observing the legal code. The lack of free expression becomes the highest form of freedom. Farcical elections become the highest form of democracy. Banning independent thought becomes the most scientific of worldviews. It falsifies the past, it falsifies the present, and it falsifies the future. Because the regime is captive to its own lies, it must falsify everything." Now, think of how prescient, how far-sighted this is, and how, with eerie kind of dart accuracy, it describes what's happening in America today. Almost every line lands with a thud. Life in the system is thoroughly permeated with hypocrisy and lies. Arbitrary abuse of power is called observing the legal code. I mean, think if someone, came to America from Mars, and let's say that they observed these Trump cases or January 6th cases. Outwardly, it appears like there's a normal legal process underway because, after all, you have an adversary system, you have statutory rules of procedure, you have a judge, you have a legal courtroom, legal vocabulary, but everything is kind of hollow because you realize that underneath all that, in a way, the whole idea of trying to arrive at truth or justice and all the accompanying rules of justice. What did this person actually do? Where have they broken the law? Are they the only person in the country that's being prosecuted for doing this, or does everybody who does this get prosecuted also? Do people who commit the same crime get roughly the same penalty? And if the answer to those questions is no, they don't. This is the only guy being prosecuted. You know that while the form of the law is being observed, the substance of the law is being denied. Now we turn to George Orwell. "Intellectuals," says George Orwell, "are more totalitarian in outlook than the common people." Very interesting statement. You might think that the peasant or the ordinary guy is going to be like, oh yeah, I want to be a tyrant because I don't have a lot of power in my ordinary life. I would love to have some power through political. No, Orwell goes, the intellectual is more susceptible to the appeal of tyranny than the ordinary guy. Most of them, writes Orwell, are perfectly ready for dictatorial methods, secret police, systematic falsification of history, etc., so long as they feel it is on, quote, our side. And this is very creepy, because what Orwell is really saying is that nobody wants tyranny for themselves, but they take a certain pleasure and relish in imposing tyranny on others. And it's actually easy to see why, for two separate reasons. One is it gives your side an unfair advantage. It puts you on top without even having to fight, right? I don't have to argue with that guy. I've just censored him. I don't have to compete with him in elections. I've just jailed him. So tyranny is appealing in that sense. And tyranny is also appealing because it is a raw exercise of power. And if you think of what intellectuals are all about, they're always drawing blueprints for society. Society would be better if you only did this. If you only listened to me and organized things this way, the world would be better. But of course, by and large, people don't listen. And so there's a little part of the intellectual that goes, well, you know, it's kind of a pity that my great idea can't be forced on people. Wouldn't it be great if there was some sort of dictator, I mean, ideally me, but if not somebody else, who says, let me take Professor so-and-so's idea and impose it on the whole society. That way, the intellectual's theory would be converted to action. And this helps to explain the tyrannical mentality of the intelligentsia, an intelligentsia that I point out mainly comes from the political left. So looking at this, these are just three snapshots from far-seeing writers about tyranny. I think we can see that none of what they're talking about bears any remote resemblance to Donald Trump. But all of it, almost to the letter, evokes, points to, and is an indicator of the tyrannical mentality and the tyrannical actions that come from Democrats and from the left. FDNY firefighter Daniel Foley assisted in rescue and recovery efforts at Ground Zero, but Daniel couldn't have known then that his heroism would cost him his life. More than 18 years later, his death, like so many others, resulted from 9/11 related illnesses caused by the toxic dust that formed when the Twin Towers collapsed. Victims and first responders are still suffering and dying from 9/11, yet children in this nation are growing up unaware of America's darkest day. That's why the Tunnel to Towers 9/11 Institute is helping educators teach children about 9/11. Tunnel to Towers 9/11 curriculum units have scripted lessons, background for teachers, and activities for students. They're based on first-person accounts and designed to meet academic standards. The 9/11 Institute offers the Discovering Heroes book series, a speakers bureau, a mobile exhibit with 9/11 artifacts, and memorial scholarships for the children of the Foundation's program recipients. Help our nation keep its promise to never forget. How can you help? Donate $11 a month to Tunnel to Towers at T2T.org. That's T, the number 2, T.org. I want you to order Balance of Nature fruits and veggies in a capsule, but before you do that, wait till you hear what I have to say. If you go to balanceofnature.com, you'll check out these. This is their popular fruit and veggie supplements, fruit and veggies in a capsule. But you might see a discount offer pop up. It may say 20% or 25% off your first order. Well, don't click that. Why? Because if you use my promo code, you'll get 35% off your first order plus free shipping. The special code is simply the word America. Use the code and save big. Here's another bonus. Balance of Nature has a risk-free money-back guarantee. So go ahead and find out for yourself what I already know. There's no other product out there like Balance of Nature when it comes to fruit and veggie supplements. supplements, whether you order online or call direct. You got to use promo code America to get the special offer, 35% off and free shipping. Here's the number to call, 800-246-8751. Again, 800-246-8751, or go to balanceofnature.com. When you use discount code America, you get 35% off and free shipping. It's time for our Friday roundup, and we're going to be getting to Debbie's favorite topic. And I say favorite topic because pretty much when we get home or we have a break or we're making our coffee, she's on the Weather Channel, and you're following the trajectory.
But we're not talking about that right now.
Yeah, no, I was going to say we're going to get to it. We're going to get to...
I gotcha.
I think we're going to save the best for last, so to speak.
Yeah.
But we want to start by talking about...
I thought you were going to say my favorite subject, Israel.
Well, actually, to be honest, Israel is also a topic that you care a lot about.
I do.
And you care a lot about for... I think maybe reasons different than a lot of other people, because of course, by and large, for people in Israel, but also for Jews in America, they look at Israel in terms of a homeland for the Jews. They look at it in terms of strategy. In some cases, they look at what's in the U.S. national interest. But you have a kind of a larger framework, which is a biblical framework. And so we did a very interesting sort of thumbnail for today, which is a quote from Genesis, right? So read the quote so we can reflect upon it and ask, what does this tell us about the world we live in today?
Right. So what does Genesis 12:3 mean? So it says, "And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." And the you is Israel.
Okay. And who is talking to whom?
So God is talking to Abraham.
Okay. So this is at the very beginning, one of the very early chapters. I mean, basically the beginning of the Hebrew scriptures. And God is saying this to Israel. Now, right away, we should address there are going to be some Christians who will say, well, that's the Old Testament, which was a covenant between God and the Jews. But then along came Jesus, and we were propelled into a new covenant, and we have, of course, a New Testament to go with it. And all of this is sort of interesting, but it's ancient history, and it doesn't describe the Israel of today or even the world of today. And what would you say to those people?
I beg to differ, because this Israel was the Israel where Jesus was crucified, correct?
You're saying it's the same place. It's the same physical land.
Physical land, physical place, and it is the place where he will return.
And you're saying it's the same people. It's the Jews, right, as a tribe, as a group, who were expelled, as the Bible in fact predicted, thrown to the ends of the earth. And you're saying they have reassembled back in their exact same spot.
Right. Exactly. And so geopolitically, there are a lot of people that are like, well, I don't know why we're helping Israel. Why should we care? Why should they, they can defend themselves, blah, blah, blah. But if you are really to take the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, because let's say you really don't see the two correlate, which I do, but if you don't, you still know that the Bible prophecy says that people will return to Israel. So regardless of what you think of God making that covenant, right, or not, the return place is a place, and that place happens to be Israel. That happens to be Jerusalem, correct? So if we don't help Israel, if these Islamic terrorists, which are supercharged and evil, if they destroy the very place that God says will be the place where Jesus comes back, I feel like it's our responsibility to make sure that place is still there.
Now, this is a very kind of interesting line of analysis, because it differs from the way in which we normally consider wars or political questions, right? So, for example, let's look at Putin and Ukraine. I would say that if we look fairly at that situation, there is in fact some right and wrong on both sides. Obviously, the the invasion is precipitated by Putin. So he is clearly, in that sense, the bad guy. He invaded. However, there is also a kind of history behind that. Not only was Kyiv and most of what we now call Ukraine part of Russia at one time, but after the end of the Cold War, when Putin actually wanted to become part of the West, when Russia wanted to join, Russia even talked about joining NATO. NATO basically refused and began to mobilize these areas like Ukraine against Russia. And so, in other words, the provocation, at least from Putin's point of view, comes really from the side of the West. They're encircling Putin, and any large country that is being encircled on its own borders is going to get very jittery about that and want to lash out and basically shut that down. So we're not applying a biblical analysis. We're just looking at facts, at history, at the balance of power. But you're saying with Israel, we should apply a double analysis where we don't set aside this geopolitical analysis, but you're saying that there is a much more clear-cut kind of good and evil, God's side and the enemies of God's side. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying is that regardless of, I mean, we had a guest, Joel Rosenberg, on the podcast a couple of days ago. You were obviously here. And he was saying Israel today is a very secular society.
Yeah.
I mean, he was kind of admitting that Israel is not exactly marching to God's orders these days. Well, I guess they didn't that much in the old days either.
Exactly.
They were never consistently faithful to the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But you're saying, nevertheless, that this divine sort of hand on Israel, and I wouldn't even call it a hand of protection, because remember, Joel Rosenberg even said, he goes, God could be in some ways punishing Israel.
Yeah. I don't know about that, but I think God is going to punish all of us, really. I mean, all of the people that have shunned away from him, that have turned away from him,
they have to
will be punished. That we have to be accountable. I mean, obviously we have to be accountable. Now, I look at Israel in a kind of a different light than say Russia, China with Taiwan, even Venezuela with Guyana, because they want to acquire Guyana as well. So all of those things are, okay, well, that's the world we live in. We have dictators,
territorial
we
ambitions,
have tyrants. They want land. But with Israel, you do have to go back and you have to look at the miracles that take place in Israel. The fact that the Jews scattered throughout the world, which is what what God predicted would happen, and the fact that they're back, and the fact that the Muslims were not there to begin with. That wasn't their land to begin with. Now,
this is a very good point,
right?
Because all the anti-colonial sort of rhetoric, which says that Israel is the colonizer, you notice that when it comes to discussing America and the native Indians, they always go to the question of who was there at the beginning. Because there were obviously wars going back and forth, and there were wars that the Indians won, and there were wars that the Cowboys won.
The Mexicans.
Right,
Yeah.
Exactly. So, but the question is determined by the left to be settled by essentially the question of aboriginalism, which is kind of who was there at the outset. And if you apply that same test to Israel, the answer is obvious.
Yes.
The Jews were there at the outset.
Right.
And it is right there, buried under the ground. It is
As
there
they
in
discover.
artifacts. It is there in stones. We've seen it for ourselves.
Yes.
And I thought it was very telling when our friend Zev Ornstein said, he said that there are many delegations that come through to look at these artifacts. And they say they're very impressed, right? But then when Zev says to them, listen, why don't you simply make a declaration? Don't worry about whether it's a one-state solution or a two-state solution. Don't even make a declaration about today. Just make a declaration that you have seen the evidence that the Jews were there in the beginning. In other words, the Jews are the ancient inhabitants of this land. And these guys
will not do it.
Immediately go, can't say that.
Yeah.
It's true, but we're not willing to say it.
Yep.
And what you're saying is that is that is not only historically telling, but it's kind of biblically telling.
Biblically telling. And of course, when it says those who bless will be blessed, those who curse will be cursed. So when I just made a joke about Macron calling for, an arms ban, not sending any arms to Israel, the first thing that came to my mind was, you will be cursed. I mean, that was like...
In other words, you're saying that this guy's not just making a miscalculation, that in some ways, whether you're on Israel's side or not, and one can obviously reasonably debate, should the United States be providing this or providing that? But what you're saying is what we shouldn't be debating is, should our moral stance be for Israel? You're saying it should emphatically be yes.
Emphatically be yes. I don't even understand how that could even be a question if you are a believer, whether you are a believer in, God of Israel and not Jesus Christ, if you're a Jew or if you're a Christian, there's no question about it.
And you're saying it is stated not only right there in Scripture in black and white, but it is at the very beginning of Scripture. It's almost like one of the first, apart from creation and the making of nature and the making of man, it's really one of God's original commitments.
Absolutely. His promise.
Are you feeling overwhelmed by the increasing cost of health insurance? Have you had enough of not having control over your healthcare dollars? Introducing Share Right. It's healthcare done the right way. At Share Right, you're not just a number, you're part of a caring community. Forget about paying excessive premiums. With Share Right, you stand to save 30 to 50% compared to health insurance. So think about what you could do with all those savings. But it's more than just savings. Share Right ensures you have access to the care you deserve precisely when you need it, from routine checkups to unexpected emergencies. With Share Right, your healthcare is their top priority. Empower yourself today by taking control of your healthcare costs. Visit shareright.org/Dinesh to learn more. See how much you can save. Visit shareright.org/Dinesh. That's shareright.org/Dinesh for healthcare done the right way. Mike Lindell is such a good guy. He's got a heart of gold, and Mike and MyPillow love giving back to those in need. They sent a truckload of 14,000 MyPillows to those impacted by Hurricane Helene. But even though Mike loves to give back, a large retail store just canceled a huge order that had already left the warehouse. So besides giving to those in need, Mike wants to pass some savings directly on to you. For the first time ever, you can get a standard classic MyPillow for wholesale prices, just $14.88. It gets better. For a limited time, they're offering their entire classic collection at wholesale prices. So get a queen-size MyPillows, $18.88. Upgrade to a king for only $1 more. Get the body pillows for just $29.88, and multi-use MyPillows for $9.88. Go to mypillow.com, use promo code Dinesh, or you can call 800-876-0227. Again, it's 800-876-0227 to take advantage of the wholesale pricing for the first time ever. On top of that, get free shipping on orders over $75. The deals haven't been offered this low before. So once again, go to mypillow.com, use promo code Dinesh, get the standard MyPillow, $14.88, the lowest price ever. By the way, limited quantities at this price, so once they're gone, they're gone. We're back, and we want to talk in our second segment about, well, I won't say just about ProLife SpiderMan, but it's interesting because when I did my locals conversation on Tuesday, there were some people in that conversation who had seen the interview, and I think they were genuinely a little divided, because I think they felt, ProLife SpiderMan is making kind of a good point, and his good point is that we want to decrease the number of abortions. We don't want them to increase, and we want the Republican Party to be the party that champions that decrease. And so if the Republican Party is sort of backing away a little bit, easing up on what has been a pretty consistent pro-life stance, that does represent a problem. And what ProLife SpiderMan is trying to do is use his leverage to say, okay, well, listen, the way that coalition politics works is we support you, but you deliver for us. and we're looking for the Republican Party to do that. So that was the strength, I think, of what he was saying. He was not taking the absolute position that, either no abortion or I'm not, if the Republican Party doesn't commit itself to no abortions at all. I think he was saying he wants the party to uphold its commitments, which it has had before, and yet I think there were others who were taking the view that, hey, listen, frankly, in fact, one guy put it very bluntly. He goes, listen, how many abortions do you think are going to happen in America under Trump? Probably a pretty big number. But how many will happen under Kamala? A much bigger number, because if she has her way, abortion will be legal for 9 months nationwide.
In every state.
Every state. And so just looking at that, but again, we then come back to, should votes be based upon the lesser evil? And I think the answer is quite clearly yes, right?
Yeah.
Because, and that is true in any situation.
Yeah, absolutely it is. In fact, you even made the argument with SpiderMan, call him Mason, right? Mason.
Yeah, Mason.
That, there have been instances where we have supported the lesser evil in some countries with like the Islamic radical and the not so Islamic radical, if there's such a thing. And we go for the not so Islamic radical so that the Islamic radical doesn't like completely decimate the place, right?
Well, let's, look at World War II. We allied with a really bad guy, Stalin.
Yeah.
Because another bad guy, Hitler, posed a greater threat at the time.
Right.
Now, in terms of the sheer volume of killing, Stalin was worse than Hitler. If you just look at the number of people Stalin killed, for example, in his own country, compared to Hitler, Stalin killed more. But Stalin wasn't a threat, at least not immediate to us. He became a threat, or the Soviet regime became a threat, which is why after World War II we went into the Cold War. But it seemed to me that if we look at the history of the 20th century, it's almost all decisions of the lesser evil.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we talked about Jimmy Carter and the Shah of Iran. Get rid of the Shah, the bad guy. You get Khomeini, the worst guy.
The worst
right?
guy.
You talk about how there was corruption in Venezuela on the part of the COPE, the right-wing party. But you vote the right wing out, the ProLife SpiderMan of Venezuela go, I'm not going to support the right wing party, they're corrupt.
Yeah.
And then you get Hugo Chavez and the whole country's destroyed and the corruption reaches a whole different level.
Whole new level. Well, and again, I feel like he was right about the morality of abortion and right. taking a stance and all of that. But again, I go back to my point that we need, as the pro-life movement, we need to figure out a way to make people understand that life begins at conception, and that if you remove that, you are essentially killing a life, a human being. When people don't see that, when they see you know what? Like I saw on a social media post, some woman said, oh, but an embryo is not a person.
Right.
How do you convince that woman that an embryo is the beginning of a person? It actually is a person. It's the beginning stage of a person. Are you going to tell me that when you see a bud, a rose on a rose bush, you see a bud, you're like, that's not a rose? I mean, is that, you know what I mean?
Right.
Of course it's a person.
There was a comedian at one of these comedians we saw, and his analogy was so brilliant. He was basically talking about the fact that he was using the analogy of baking a cake.
Yeah.
And he said that if the cake is in the oven, I mean, it's not ready yet, it's being baked.
Right.
And you come in and you just grab it and trash it and throw it out, and someone goes, you destroyed my cake. And they go, well, it wasn't a cake. Because it's not baked yet. It is only in the process of being baked. Therefore, this guy was like, no, that was my cake right there. Sorry, but that's the cake.
Exactly. Exactly.
And so I think that But, it's hard for me to believe that woman that you're referring to sort of doesn't realize that. It's almost like I feel like the overwhelming weight of human selfishness is so heavy that it has a blinding effect.
It does. It has to. It has to.
Because it's not like we don't live in an age. There may have been an earlier age, if you go back to medieval times. Like some people thought, there's got to be a point at which somewhere in the womb, which we can't see, where life begins. And they identified it with quickening, but they didn't know. Now, when you have scientific knowledge, when the sperm and the egg come together, when fertilization takes place, the stages of gestational development, you have ultrasound, you can look and see if it's a boy or a girl, you can see the fingers.
Absolutely. And not to mention, when I had a miscarriage, my first baby was a miscarriage at 11 weeks, I didn't say, I just lost a clump of cells. I said, I lost a baby.
Right.
I mean, I knew it was a baby. Instinctively, it's a baby.
Right.
And so I just don't understand how you can turn that in.
I just saw some videos of this guy in California, and he's interviewing people, and he's talking about the fact that in California, if you kill a pregnant woman, it is a double homicide.
It is everywhere.
Yeah. And I think maybe in New York they removed it, but they removed it only because they knew that it is a standing indictment of abortion.
Exactly,
right? Because if you're prosecuting someone for a double homicide, what is that but a clear legal admission
that it's a murder?
You're dealing with two human beings, not one plus extension, but rather two human beings who are physically connected, geographically connected, but nevertheless genetically distinct.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because recently Melania Trump came out and said that she was pro-choice or does she call herself pro-choice?
She didn't use that phrase, but what she did say, she starts off by saying, very interesting and odd kind of statement, because it's a promotion for a book. And what she says is, I support freedom in all its forms, right? And then she uses the phrase just a couple of lines later, my body, my choice, which was in fact the slogan of the pro-choice movement. My body, my choice. I think what Melania Trump was trying to say is that just as we have the right to over our body when it comes to vaccines, in the same way, we women have the right over our bodies when it comes to abortion. Now,
yeah, well, that's her opinion, right? As is a lot of women's opinion, I guess. But you have to remove that from your lexicon because that is a separate person inside you, different DNA, different blood. You can have,
what you're saying is it's not the same as a vaccine.
It's not the same as a vaccine.
You're using the same slogan or the same tent to cover two totally different things.
Totally different things, because it's not even the case of I don't want to have my breast removed because that's my choice. I want to keep my breast. Don't remove my breast. Give me a lumpectomy instead. The breast is your breast. The baby is not your body.
Right. It's not your body.
It's not your
baby
body
that you conceived along with somebody else, but it is not an extension.
It's a vessel. It's a vessel for another human being to come out into the world.
Right. Now, interestingly, there are some Christians who are like, well, look at what Melania Trump said. It is worth noting that Laura Bush held the same opinion.
Nancy Reagan.
And I think maybe even Barbara Bush. I'm not totally sure, but nevertheless, and the Christian community at that time was kind of silent.
Left it alone.
They left it alone. They're like, okay, well, that's Barbara Bush, but Barbara Bush is not the president, or Laura Bush is not the president. And but in this case, Melania chose. I mean, interesting that she also chose it right now in an election season to take the. I kind of wish she didn't.
Yeah.
But that seems to be her opinion. But again, she has not been an active figure in government. Now, quite honestly, other people have been. We know, of course, Hillary Clinton was very active, but even Nancy Reagan was around the White House quite a bit. And I don't think ideologically motivated, but getting very involved in Reagan's business, partly to protect Reagan. Like, oh, that guy's trying to get rid of Reagan, and I gotta go, spike that guy. Nancy Reagan, in that sense, got her hands dirty. Melania Trump is a sort of a graceful...
But she also didn't influence Reagan. Reagan was very staunchly pro-life.
Reagan was staunchly pro-life.
Remember what he said about those that oppose abortion have never been born.
Oh, he goes, yeah,
have all been born.
I noticed that all the people who are for abortion have already been born.
Yeah, I love
it's
that.
It's very similar to what Lincoln said, where Lincoln basically said something like, whenever I see a guy argue for the benefits of slavery, I feel a strong desire to have it tried on them personally. Right?
Awesome.
Yeah, really awesome. Guys, the movie Vindicating Trump is coming to locals and coming to locals very soon. So this is a perfect time to check out and join my locals channel. Become an annual subscriber. I post a lot of exclusive content there, including content that's censored on other social media platforms. On locals, you get Dinesh Unchained, Dinesh Uncensored. You can get to know me much better personally, and you can interact with me directly. I do a live weekly Q&A every Tuesday. No topic is off limits. I also have Dinesh's movie page on locals. My older films are up there, 2000 Mules, Police State, and the new one, Vindicating Trump, coming to my locals channel imminently. Hey, if you're an annual subscriber, you can stream and watch this content for free. It's included with your subscription. So check out the channel. It's dinesh.locals.com. I'd love to have you along for this great ride. Again, it's dinesh.locals.com. We're now on our third and final topic for today and for our roundup, and that is hurricanes. Now, you've been tracking these things for really as long as I've known you, right? And you actually follow even hurricanes that aren't coming our way per se, particularly because I think, what is it? Is it that you have a certain awe of the power of nature?
That, and I've experienced hurricanes since I was 11 years old.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated by hurricanes. I just remember as a kid, like 11 years old, newly in America. Of course, we lived in Harlingen with my grandparents. And I just remember every time that there was a hurricane in the Gulf and it was maybe headed our way, my grandpa would go to the lumber yard and get like plywood, and I would help him board the house up. Like that was our ritual. Every time we had a hurricane, we would board the windows, and it was like really kind of scary for an 11-year-old to do this and go, why are we doing this? And then my grandpa would be, so that the windows don't break. And I was like, well, if the wind is that strong, won't it take the whole house? And my grandpa would look at me kind of like, well, you got a point there.
It could happen if it's strong enough.
Yeah. And so then we would all get in the car, pack all our stuff. I remember I would bring my little doll because obviously I couldn't bring everything else, and we'd pack up and we'd head somewhere where we didn't think the hurricane was coming. Sometimes the hurricane would actually follow us and go to that place we were going.
Right.
But besides that, it has fascinated me all my life. And I do know that my grandma talked about some really bad ones in the 60s. I remember at the house there in Harlingen, she talked about Hurricane Beulah, which I believe was in 67, maybe 69, I think 67. But anyway, they had about 5 feet of water in their house. It practically ruined their house. I mean, everything. Yeah. Lots of flooding. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, that. So the realization that a hurricane is coming your way and that can happen was a little hard to take. But yet I noticed that nobody moved. Everyone just stayed in their house. They repaired their house and they lived on. And so this has been kind of my reality for I'm 58 years old for well over 50 years.
I mean, I noticed that there are certain countries and certain states in the Union in America that take a very stoic and practical attitude to hurricanes. Mm-hmm. In terms of countries, my favorite, Japan. they get some horrific cyclones, hurricanes, natural disasters. You never hear a word of complaint about them. You never see the Japanese on the international news, help us.
Well, that and earthquakes, as you know.
They have massive
bad
earthquakes,
ones.
bad ones. They just essentially zip it and they start working to rebuild.
They're not complainers.
They're not complainers. And similarly, in the United States, I mean, look at the difference in the reactions to hurricanes in Texas versus, say, Katrina in Louisiana. Now, we were talking about this in the car on the way over, and you were saying partly you think there's a kind of an ideological component to that, right? In other words, Louisiana had a Democratic mayor. They had did they have a Democratic governor as well? And so the usual Democratic victimology and whining.
Yeah, but so this is what's really funny about that, is that it was all Democrats. But guess who was president?
Bush.
So they blame Bush and FEMA, right? Because they didn't do their job.
Right.
The Democrat mayor and the Democrat governor, they couldn't do anything. They were at a standstill.
There were a whole bunch of people that left the state and never came back.
They came to Houston.
Texas.
Hello. Oh. So anyway, a lot of unfortunate criminals from Louisiana came to Houston and wreaked havoc in Houston. But that's another story.
Well,
I digress.
I also mentioned earlier in the week that the press is now taking the line, don't criticize FEMA.
Right.
It's very dangerous to do that.
So it's the opposite of what happened.
Right. Because this time there's a Democratic administration.
Exactly
in place.
Right.
And I even read that some of these media outlets are going back and deleting their old articles because the inconsistency is too obvious and is bound to be pointed out, and people are going to make memes about it.
So I have a couple of stats here that are kind of interesting. Let me look for it. Let's see. So the kind of the worst hurricanes in U.S. history, they go back to, there's one here in 1884 in Texas that had the millibar at 925. Now, I believe Milton dipped into the 800s, but it stayed consistently in like the 920s. That just means that the pressure is very high, which makes it a more powerful hurricane. And then the Florida Keys, 1919, they had a really bad one. Florida in 1928, another really bad one. Louisiana in 1915, New Orleans, horrible. Carla, 61. My grandma talked about Carla also. So they had a really bad one in Carla. They had a really bad one in Beulah. And so I always say that these are cyclical. I mean, they just are. We're always going to have hurricanes.
So you're saying that if you were to look at let's just identify the most dangerous hurricanes, right? Call them super hurricanes. You're saying that there is no consistent pattern of the number of super hurricanes increasing as the years go on, because quite clearly there is an increase over time of the amount of carbon that human beings put into the atmosphere. That's just the effect of industry, and it's the effect of the population of the world growing. So more human beings, more carbon. And if it were the case that these super hurricanes were produced by that, you would expect there to be, let's just say, maybe one super hurricane in the late 19th century, and maybe two in the early 20th, and maybe four in the 1920s, and maybe eight in the 1950s and 60s, and maybe 12 today. But no such pattern is observable. Yeah.
Well, I'll give you an example. Like here in Houston, we have a bad hurricane about every 8 years.
Right.
And it's been like this for a long, long time. As far as I can remember.
Lived in Houston now.
I've lived in Houston 35 years of my life, right? So on the Gulf Coast, imagine, right? So I've seen them consistently. Every 8 to 10 years they come. We had one recently in July, Category 1. Very bad.
Quite destructive. And before that, Harvey.
Right. And I kept telling you, it's like, the farther down we go, the further the months we go, the less chance that we're going to get one in Texas. Why? Because the trough of low pressure is pushing the wind towards Florida. And so every time that there's a system coming, where does it go? It goes east to Florida.
You're saying it's a little cooler here.
Exactly.
As we go into the fall.
We're getting cold fronts. And so the more cold fronts we get, unfortunately for Florida, the more they're going to get. They're going to get the systems. And so I pray that that's not going to be the case, but there are a couple of systems right now in the Atlantic that may even merge. And so we may get a super hurricane out of it, and hopefully it'll stay away from the Yucatan, because typically when they come into the Yucatan Peninsula is when they start kind of getting their because the water in the Gulf of Mexico is extremely warm, and so that they kind of get their power, but hopefully it'll stay away.
I mean, the neglect of the citizens who are affected by these hurricanes by the government really shows you that it really makes a difference who's running our government.
Yes.
Right? Because this stuff is going to come to haunt you and to bite you. And it does in many ways. It's not just hurricanes. It's also things like crime.
Yeah.
Right? You have a government, when New York was run by Giuliani, and then even Bloomberg, crime was down. The city was clean. It was safe. Now it's not so clean. Now it's not so safe.
Yep.
So the kind of governments we put in place have an impact on our safety.
And our peace of mind, too, because as you notice, the money, they're like, oh, FEMA's running out of money. We're running out of money. Well, where is some of that money going to, right?
Right.
A lot of it's going to house illegals. And that is a fact. That's not a misinformation campaign. That's a fact.
Well, that's off the FEMA website.
Exactly. So it's a fact. So perhaps if we didn't house illegals, perhaps if we didn't allow illegals, we would have more money for these natural disasters that occur every few years and that do wreak havoc on U.S. citizens. Because, Florida's a great place to live. It's beautiful. It's warm. But it is a bit dicey.
It takes a beating
when it comes to these disasters.
I think the political lesson couldn't be more clear. And as if you don't vote for America first, you're going to be getting America last.
Subscribe to the Dinesh D'Souza podcast on Apple, Google, and Spotify, or watch on Rumble, YouTube, and SalemNow.com.